Welcome to the final seminar of this academic year in our series Liberalism and Conservatism at a Crossroads. This program has been made possible through the collaboration of a team, including Catherine Marchal, CY Paris University, Nathalie Champroux and Stéphane Porion, University of Tours, Catherine Tournier-Saul, University of Toulon, she's there, little hand, Stéphane Revillier, Bourgogne Europe University, and myself from Sorbonne Nouvelle University. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Matt Sleat. Matt Sleat is Professor of Politics at the University of Sheffield, specializing in realist political thought, liberal philosophy, and international relations theory. He is the author of Post-Liberalism 2025. I recommend this as a must-read. And Liberal Realism 2013. He's the editor of Politics Recovered 2018 and has published extensively in leading journals. The list is very, very long. He currently serves as co-editor of the European Journal of Political Theory. His talk today is entitled Post-Liberalism and its Critics. So we're very pleased to welcome him today and look forward to hearing his insights on important and timely questions. Matt, over to you.
Thank you very much, and a genuine thank you for the invitation. It really is great to be able to speak to you all today. I do want to start with, I'm afraid, 3 apologies. One is that my dog will be making an appearance at about just before 2 o'clock, as he has to. My wife is doing an interview, and he has to be taken away from my wife. So he will be deposited in my study at some point, and may make himself known. The other apology is that London is going through what we call a heat wave. You would just call it normal summer. And I could not find my fan before this seminar, so it's very warm in my study. The other apology is for the somewhat lazy and derivative title of the talk. I hope I'm not alone in finding invitations like this to speak to audience such as this impossible to refuse, even when there's no paper in sight or at hand. So the title that I offered you was therefore sort of purposefully vague, buying myself time for the muses to work their magic, and whether they needed longer, I'll leave up to you to decide. But that said, the title does somewhat surreptitiously capture something of what I want to talk to you about today. Sorry, I just need to try and get my screen to work for me. So I'm conscious that not everyone here will be familiar with post-liberalism. So I want to begin by my remarks by saying something introductory about what post-liberalism is. Though for reasons that should become clear, it's the post-liberal critique of liberalism that's of most relevance to what I want to say, rather than the liberal alternative to liberalism. And so that's where my brief remarks are going to be focused, on the critique of liberalism rather than sort of post-liberal theory as an alternative. I shall also be restricting my focus here specifically to the American post-liberals. So most notably the Harvard constitutional theorist Adrian Vermeule, Notre Dame political theorist Patrick Deneen. Now my justification for that is not so much, well, in my recent book, in the book that I was referenced, I have this focus, but I have the focus there because I basically couldn't find a way of talking about the American post-liberals and their British post-liberal counterparts as part of a coherent ism. So I focus mainly on the American post-liberals. But here, my focus is, the justification for my focus is different. It's because it's the American post-liberals who have most clearly elicited the response from liberals that I'm going to be interested in. Because while I want to say something about the post-liberal critique of liberalism, really, it's how liberals have reacted to that critique that I want to focus on, and what I think that tells us about the current predicament that liberalism finds itself in. So I hope that makes some sense. So in terms of, so post-liberalism. So post-liberals vehemently and comprehensively reject liberalism, right? In all its forms, all its iterations. As the post-liberals understand it, liberalism is primarily a philosophy committed to the maximization of individual freedom. So what motivates the post-liberals think, is a zealous dedication to eradicating the barriers to individuals' will, to pursuing their wishes and their desires, regardless of their moral quality or wider social consequences. And from that follows a fairly recognizable set of corollary commitments that be of no surprise to anyone familiar with the general conservative critiques of liberalism. So liberals are people dedicated to some sort of atomistic, individualistic anthropology, that humans have natural pre-political rights which have primacy over duties, that political authority is created by a social contract, by consent. Liberals are committed to a minimal and morally neutral state, and they have an almost religious reverence for progress, understood as this permanent quest to reveal and remove every unchosen fetter on the individual will. And that, post-liberals believe, captures the essential essence of the entire liberal tradition. If you can hear, that's my dog. He's even yet to make an appearance, actually. He's just barking at the dog next door. I hope it's not too distracting. So this is what post-liberals think is the complete essence of the entire liberal tradition, right? From its earliest advocates in Hobbes and Bacon, right up to its more progressive identitarian iteration. Indeed, for the post-liberals, they think there is no meaningful difference between the standard, that standard dichotomy of a classical liberalism with its particular emphasis on individuals' economic freedom, and a more contemporary woke liberalism focused around issues of identity, trans rights, and so on. Right? But for post-liberals, these are just varieties on the liberal theme of maximizing individuals' freedoms. And they think that sort of having worked their way through removing all the political and economic obstacles to the individual will, that liberal search for unchosen bonds would always inevitably lead liberals to want to do away eventually with those unchosen biological dimensions of the human condition, right? So in that sense, classical and progressive liberalism are just two sides of the same coin, and they reject liberalism, therefore, completely, because they're both committed to their maximization of individual freedom, and that's what post-liberals thinks. Well, they obviously say that post-liberals think it's false. Post-liberals think that liberal philosophy is to be false. But on the one hand, the evidence for the errors of liberalism lies in their being contradictory to what they see as a truth about human nature and the human condition. And again, these are claims pretty familiar from the conservative canon. So humans are naturally social, duties precede rights, liberalism is a barely concealed cover for atheism, liberalism is anti-family, and so on, right? So that's pretty familiar and in a sense uninteresting because not novel sense. But on the other hand, I think what's interesting about post-liberalism now is they also think that they have history on their side, and where they maybe differ from their conservative predecessors. For they would claim from the perspective of a couple of decades into the 21st century, has history not shown us that liberalism is false, right? Indeed, its falsity is precisely why, to use the title of Deneen's book, liberalism failed, right? The history of the past half millennium or so in the West is, according to post-liberalism, essentially the history of this liberal commitment to maximizing individual freedom being rolled out and implemented through every aspect of society. And as such, it's the cause of every dimension of our current malaise, right? Economic, political, social, environmental, spiritual. The cause is always to be found, they think, in liberal philosophy. So liberalism has failed because it succeeded in putting its specious ideas into practice. So essentially what they're saying is, economic stagnation, environmental devastation, social anomie, political populism, spiritual hollowness, deaths of despair. This, post-liberals say, this is the world that liberalism has made, right? These are liberalism's ruins. And so only some non-liberal alternative can therefore offer us a way out. So as brief as that's been, I hope it gives you some sense of the post-liberal critique. In what follows, I want to focus, as I say, not so much on post-liberalism, but on the main forms that liberals' response to post-liberalism has taken. Or at least one of the main forms, I should say, that liberals' response to post-liberalism has taken. And I'm going to call this the misunderstanding objection. And unsurprisingly, this objection is essentially a complaint that post-liberalism rests upon a fundamentally flawed interpretation of liberalism, which then fatally undermines the cogency and persuasiveness of both its critique of contemporary politics and therefore the appeal of the alternative that it offers in its place. And though I'm going to say something about the merits of this objection, and I think there are many, that's not really what I'm interested in here. Rather, the focus of my attention is going to be on what this objection tells us, not about post-liberalism, but about liberalism. I'm going to question, essentially, just how far this misunderstanding objection, even when we have good reason to think it's sound, how far it actually gets us. And not as far as liberal theorists tend to think is going to be my answer. And that tells us something important about the fix that liberalism currently finds itself in. So strap yourselves in. Right. So, I mean, not much work, I think, is needed to show that post-liberals get liberalism terribly and egregiously wrong. And representing such low-hanging intellectual fruit, it may therefore not be surprising this has probably been the most familiar response that we have seen from liberals. And I'm going to assume that for this audience, a couple of very quick remarks will be enough to demonstrate the general point. One is that it would be very difficult, I mean, maybe someone will disagree with me and can think of someone, but I can't think of any liberal thinker who holds all of the beliefs that post-liberals ascribe to liberalism, right? And bear in mind, they think liberalism is a singular monolithic thing and all liberals are signed up to the same set of commitments. So, for example, just to take one instance, I mean, the notion that political authority is created via social contract was rejected by, among others, Berlin, Constant, Dewey, Green, Hayek, Hume, Popper, Rand, Shklar, and Smith, right? The other point to make, I think, is that even if we granted post-liberals their definition and narrowed our focus to liberals as people who want to maximize individual freedom, right, who are committed to negative freedom, as we would now call it, it's telling that even those people, or those thinkers that post-liberals take to be exemplar liberals, not only fail to hold that view, they straightforwardly reject that view. So Locke here is illustrative. I mean, Locke, it's obviously a historical debate right now, but they take Locke to be one of the first and an exemplar liberal. But Locke did not believe in the maximization of individual freedom. I mean, any student of the history of political thought should be able to tell you that Locke very famously distinguished between liberty and license, and argued that freedom was acting rationally, i.e. in accordance with the divinely prescribed law of nature. It was not pursuing your own wishes or desires. I think, but I don't talk about Kant very interestingly, but I think, by a very different philosophical route, Kant holds pretty much the same view. Not that freedom is doing what you want, but freedom is doing what is rational, or something along those lines. So even exemplar liberals aren't committed to the view of liberalism that post-liberals think is characteristic of the liberal disposition. So liberalism, I think all of us will know, is a rich and internally diverse political tradition, ensuring that any attempt to impose coherence and unity upon it, by friend or foe, I should say, always requires a certain amount of cherry picking and creative selectivity. But when no single canonical figure from the tradition fits your definition, I think that should be taken as overwhelming evidence that one has slid squarely into the field of fiction. If post-liberals are right about what liberalism is, then we'd be forced to accept the bizarre conclusion that there have been no liberals, where the more appropriate inference, of course, would be that the post-liberal interpretation of liberalism cannot be right. So all of that is to say, and I hope that's not too controversial, but that the misunderstanding objection, I think, is made on the solidest of grounds against post-liberalism. Now, though I don't believe one needs to be a scholar of the history of political thought to recognise the problems with that post-liberal interpretation of liberalism, several historians, both academic and non-academic, have undoubtedly done us a great service in recent years in presenting us with excellent accounts that provide overwhelming and authoritative evidence, I think, of post-liberals' mistakes. And, to name names, I'm thinking here in no particular order, the likes of Helena Rosenblatt's The Lost History of Liberalism, Alan Cahan's mammoth Freedom from Fear, Annalyn Degin's Freedom Unruly History, Edmund Forkett's Liberalism, Samuel Moyne's Liberalism Against Itself, and most recently Adrian Wooldridge's Centrists of the World Unite. And naturally, these books all differ in a variety of ways, but they have they have different stories they want to tell as to liberalism's history. But they share a central objective of wanting to decenter or disrupt a certain view of liberalism, which sort of overlaps with that of post-liberals, one in which negative freedom and moral neutrality take centre stage. So their charge against the post-liberals, and people like Moyne in particular, I guess, and maybe most explicitly, is responding specifically to, he talks about Deneen and presents the book as almost a response to Deneen. Their charge against post-liberals and other critics is that they essentially mistake more contemporary iterations of liberalism, be they Cold War liberalism, neoliberalism, or Rawlsian political liberalism. They mistake those for the entirety of the liberal tradition. Right? So they anachronistically read back certain contemporary views about the values and aims of modern liberals onto their predecessors. Yet, these historians want to argue, the forms that liberalism took from the end of the Second World War to today, that sort of combination of classical and more progressive liberalisms, were contingent developments, developed in responses to challenges of their day. Previous liberals actively rejected the negative view of freedom, right? Instead, often believing that to be free implied some connection to reason, virtue, and or pursuit of the common good, right? So where contemporary liberals may be obsessed with moral neutrality, their predecessor was obsessed, that's the word that Rosenblatt used, their predecessors were obsessed with questions of individual character. The notion that politics ought to take a stand on moral issues, or to be perfectionist in the lingo of 20th century political theory, that was pretty unquestionable for liberals before the mid-20th century. And of course, the point in telling these stories is not so much to show that liberalism's critics are ignorant as to the variety of liberalisms throughout history. Really, it's not them that the audience. Critics aren't really the audience, I think, of these sorts of books. The audience is more liberals themselves, because liberals themselves too often accept, either implicitly or explicitly, the post-liberal claim that liberalism. Sorry, no, I got that wrong. Sorry, no, the historians, in a certain sense, accept that post-liberal claims that liberalism finds itself in a challenge of its own making. The stories the historians want to tell are reminders to liberals that liberalism has been here before, that it successfully rejuvenated and renewed itself in response to the challenges of the past, and that as it was different back then, so it can essentially be different again today. So the audience, I think, is really for liberals. And historicising the present, the canvas should then be clear for liberals to paint their own new vision of liberal politics fit for the 21st century. And it's not only liberalism's critics, I think, who are then shown themselves to be ignorant of the forms that liberalism has taken in the past. I mean, liberals themselves, I think, have very often seemed unable to see beyond the dual shadow of Berlin and rules, obscuring everything, almost everything that came before them. So reminding liberals of their own history may also serve to provide them with the inspiration, or in a more workmanlike way, the intellectual resources out of which they can develop such visions, right? So they can point to paths not taken, essentially. Now, I do not want at all to diminish or undervalue the service that these historians have done us in recent years. I would strongly insist, in fact, that it is liberalism's historians who have often shown an imagination and urgency that more contemporary or normative political theorists in particular have by and large lacked. But I do want to ask how far this misunderstanding objection really gets us. I mean, and there's one obvious sense in which it leaves almost all the work for the defender of liberalism still ahead of them. But even if it's true that post-liberalism gets liberalism wrong and so misdiagnoses our current malaise, it does not show what I presume the liberal still wants to show, which is that liberalism represents the most desirable and effective way forward, that it still has the vitality and ideas necessary to address our numerous issues. In that sense, even those historical works that recall the variety of different forms liberalism has taken and how liberalism has adapted to changing circumstances and challenges in the past, in themselves, they do little more than remind us that liberalism has proven itself adaptable previously. But what that cannot tell us in itself is whether, some 2.5 decades deep into the 21st century, liberalism either retains enough adaptability today, or more importantly, this is the point I really want to press, more importantly, whether the very conditions for a meaningful liberal politics are still present. Right? That's the point I really want to press, whether the conditions for a meaningful liberal politics are still present. So to do that, let me begin with an insight which has recently been forcefully articulated by those involved in the re-emergence of realism within contemporary Anglo-American political thought, but I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to it. The chief inspiration of this new realism has been the British philosopher Bernard Williams. I don't know how far the realist influence has sort of made its way much further than our own little shores, actually, but so I'll give a very potted account here. But in particular, his what's proven to be most influential has been his posthumous collection of essays in political philosophy entitled "In the Beginning Was the Deed." And in the eponymous chapter of that book, Williams spends some time, one should probably say still not enough time, but some time explaining why he believed this phrase, "in the beginning was the deed," which is obviously taken from Goethe's Faust and famously employed by Wittgenstein in Uncertainty, why that phrase captures something significant that he believed, and the realists who have followed him believe, needs to be taken more seriously by political theorists. The central thought is that, as Williams puts it, this is a quote, "Political projects are essentially conditioned, not just in their background conditions, but as a matter of empirical realism by their historical circumstances. Those circumstances almost always are created not by our thought, but by other people's actions. It follows that whether our thoughts even make political sense depends to an indefinite degree on other people's actions." So the point, I think, is essentially one about the relationship between political theories, in a very broad sense, and the social conditions within which they can make sense as sensible guides to action. Political theories don't get to determine their own social conditions. What our social conditions are is a matter effectively determined by the historical context in which we happen to find ourselves. We do not choose them in any meaningful sense. They are created, or indeed have been created, by the actions of others. And recognizing that the deed comes first is therefore to insist that the question of whether we can make sense of political theory as a meaningful way of us collectively going forward, that's not a question that's internal to a theory, that a theory gets to answer on its own terms, so to speak, but it's a question that must be answerable to the realities of the social conditions in which we find ourselves. And so for that reason, realists have been pressing that it's crucial for theory and theorists to begin with an appropriate appreciation of what those social conditions are. Too much political theory, so realists contend, ignore that, assuming that its readers are something like founding fathers to be, quote again from Williams, told how best he or she can start from the ground up, perhaps not in a state of nature, but at least having just got off the boat, right? And that's to theorize for a world that's not only yet to be created by the action of others, but in which the others are not even there, right? It's a world, whatever its attractions for a theorist, bears little resemblance to our own. So to give an example of what this means for political theory, or what realists think this means for political theory, one particularly frequent but egregious error realists charge much contemporary Anglo-American, analytical political theory of making in this regard is to assume the presence of some communality of purpose or some background consensus or agreement on moral values, which then provides a foundation upon which the political theory is then constructed, be it autonomy, dignity, or something like that. But that overlooks the extent to which we not only conflict and disagree about our ends, our interests, and our values, but that those disagreements provide a large part of the reason why we need politics in the first place. Right? We need to find ways of living together, despite the fact that we disagree about how we should live together. That's what Jeremy Waldron calls the circumstances of politics. So political theories, in other words, can't just wish away the deep and profound conflicts characteristic, especially of highly pluralistic societies like our own. That's just a fact of modern societies, and it should be treated as a fact. Or to give another example, for us now and around here, as Williams liked to put it, modernity should be treated as, quote, a basic category of social and hence of political understanding, and hence the most general conditions of modernity be taken as given. And that, Williams insists, is the important lesson that we ought to take from Benjamin Constant's famous Liberty of the Ancients compared to that of the moderns. Again, quote, that whatever the merits for an ancient republic of a concept of liberty linked to republican virtue, they were essentially limited to the conditions of an ancient republic. And only disaster could follow, as it had indeed followed in France, from trying to apply such an ideal to a modern commercial society. In that sense, what the realists are not charging is that utopian or idealist political theory is in some sense analytically or conceptually incoherent, as they've sometimes been interpreted as doing. Rather, the point is really that theories risk becoming obliquely related to our actual political discourse, the less they acknowledge the facts of our social conditions. Right? That's to recognise the importance of what my colleague Ed Hall has helpfully dubbed the realist constraint. So, hopefully that's enough on realism. But let me just bring this back to post-liberalism quickly, because I didn't put the point in this way in my book, but one of my main lines of criticism against post-liberalism there was that it essentially fails to recognise the realist constraint. that it strays too far, too often into the realm of wishful thinking. That's basically the argument of the fifth chapter in particular. But there are several instances of this I think we could highlight, but there are three I think that are most illustrative. The first is a familiar claim that post-liberals like to make, which is that the people are in some sense already committed to post-liberal values. And that's certainly the central claim of Deneen's Regime Change, for instance, his last book, in which he interprets our modern predicament as a clash between the liberal elites and the people who are committed to a post-liberal understanding of the common good, he tells us. Now, whatever might be said for the accuracy of that description of the ruling elite as liberal, I think it's very hard to recognise that depiction of the people as calling out for post-liberalism. At a general level, polling shows what I think most of us already know, that there's very little appetite for the greater involvement of religion in public life, even among post-liberals' fellow Catholics, I should say, and that the support for more conservative policies around things like abortion, traditional family values, support for those is highly varied, to say the least. Right? It's not that the people are calling out for this in the way that Deneen presents it. So imagining that there is greater agreement on the values and the beliefs that we may personally hold dear is one of the sort of greatest temptations of wishful thinking that a realist constraint urges us to avoid. The second example of post-liberals ignoring the realist constraint relates specifically to the integralists among the post-liberals. Now, critics too often allied post-liberalism with integralism. Now, there are plenty of post-liberals who aren't integralists, and Deneen is one of them, but in Adrian Vermeulen, we do find someone, a post-liberal, whose political commitments are integralist. And so his vision of a post-liberal society is one in which the church has authority over the state. Right? So integralism is a sort of a schism, well, it basically rejects Vatican II and Dignitatis Humanae, right, and believes the church should have authority once more over the state. Though strictly speaking, the state pursues our temporal ends and the church pursues our spiritual ends, nevertheless, the church can employ the means of the state, i.e. coercion, to pursue our spiritual ends when its own means of canonical law would be insufficient, right? So it's basically a return to pre-Vatican II Catholicism, the idea that the church having authority over the state and so on. Now, people obviously complain, that such a vision just looks flat out implausible for secular and pluralistic societies like our own. They're waved away with the response that, well, once I get in power, societies will be less secular and pluralistic. So that's not really a worry, Vermeulen thinks. But a deeper problem for an integralist like Vermeulen, I think, is not that the modern state isn't going to bow down to the church, but the church has neither the capacity nor the inclination to involve itself in literal ruling, right? There's another post-liberal called Sohrab Ahmari, or at least he was a post-liberal. He's reneged. But the way he put it in a wonderful essay called The Poverty of Catholic Intellectual Life, which is where he distances himself from his previous post-liberal brothers in arms. He says, if a Roman pontiff isn't running around demanding confessional states in the 21st century, then a lay Catholic writer such as yours truly would be wise similarly to Demure. Right? So even were the people to become compliant, it's pure wishful thinking to imagine the church has any interest in playing its part in the post-liberal integralist vision. And the third example of post-liberalism falling foul of the realist constraint is, to my mind, the most fatal for it as a political project. And this is the theme of chapter 5. Now, where liberalism has, according to post-liberals, at its heart, this commitment to maximising individual freedom, the post-liberals want to replace this with a return to the classical view of freedom, which they believe liberalism usurped. And so freedom on this classical view is about choosing well rather than choices, or the quantity of the choices that one has. So being free involves discipline and training of one's character towards virtue, limiting the power or influence our desires have over us, and directing our actions towards the right ends. Liberty doesn't depend on how big the sphere is for the individual to act, but rather on their being governed by their reason so as to direct their actions towards the appropriate objects, the true goods of human flourishing. And inspired by Aristotle and his notion that all entities have their own individual telos, their natural and fixed ends, the central thought is that the human good is a matter of achieving those natural ends. I'm not telling you anything you don't know here. But that metaphysical view of the universe, in which that ethical view is situated, that the view of a universe of fixed and natural purposes, is one that has been completely displaced by an alternative mechanistic vision of nature, devoid of intrinsic value fundamental to the modern scientific worldview. I mean, Michael Gillespie, Charles Taylor, it's an incredible amount of excellent work that's been done on this. I mean, any notions of teleologies has been expelled, and without that, the classical vision of freedom becomes fundamentally incoherent. So in each case, for the post-liberal political theory to make sense, it depends upon the existence of social conditions which not only don't exist, but which are at mounting distance from the real world. And I ordered them, in a sense, relative to that distance. So we're presented with political theories that incite us to act as if ours is a world of widespread agreement with post-liberal values, to act as if the Catholic Church is both willing and able to involve itself in the government of countries, or to act as if centuries of revolt against classical metaphysics, including powerful currents from within Christianity itself, have been reversed. So better, one might well think, and certainly a realist thinks, better to act as if the world is as it is. But, in the book I made this, I guess it's easy to apply something like this to theories one doesn't particularly like. But really the realist constraint has to apply to any political theory, at least any that claims to be action guiding here and now. So this is where I want to take the discussion back to liberal theory and wrap up. Now, as I said, while the misunderstanding objection to post-liberalism has done much to remind defenders and critics of liberalism of the different forms that liberal philosophy has taken in the past and how it's overcome similar challenges in its history, what it cannot in and of itself illuminate is how far liberalism remains consistent with the realist constraint today. And there are two questions that I think we should distinguish here. One is how far the social conditions which were necessary for liberalism to make sense as a viable and meaningful way for us to organise our collective lives over the past 200 and so years, whether those conditions are still present today. And that's a question that history can help us with by identifying what those social conditions were. So history has a role to play in that. But what I would say is that to do so, it cannot treat the history of liberalism as if it was merely the history or the development of liberal ideas through the standard canon of liberal thinkers, almost wholly abstracted from the much wider economic, social, and political conditions that had to be in place for those ideas to have the purchase on the minds of real political actors that they did. And critics and defenders, I think liberals are guilty of this as well a lot of the time. They often tell stories that give a real explanatory preference to ideas, and to where there's some sort of direct and relatively immediate causal relationship between an idea and the actions of political agents. It's almost as if, Locke wrote the Second Treatise, and then England all of a sudden became all in favour of constitutional monarchy. Or Rousseau says this, and then this happens. So the histories of liberalism are usually the history of liberal ideas in a very abstract way. And that's to give too much credit, indeed all the credit actually, to the power of ideas as the engine of history, which is probably actually the only meaningful occupational hazard of professional political theorists to think that ideas are the most important things. But more importantly, for our purposes, it also, that way of doing the history of liberalism also fails to pay due attention to what it was about the context in which, say, Locke advocated constraints on monarchical authority, or when Mill celebrated the importance of individuality and autonomy to human flourishing, right? Or Hobhouse agitated for the more interventionist state that was willing to interfere in the market in order to further the common good. What was it about those contexts which meant that those ideas could appear to political agents as the basis for meaningful and credible ways forward? What was it about England in those times that made liberal ideas of freedom in particular make sense? And obviously in a way which they clearly did not at previous times or in other places. And this is the point I really want to press. We should not assume is true of Western societies today. We shouldn't assume that. History can help us identify what those social conditions were, but it cannot tell us whether those social conditions are still present now. And indeed, I should say, to be sort of self-deprecating again, it's not clear that political theory, actually, at least in the normative and analytical mode that remains dominant in the Anglo-American sphere, it's not clear to me that political theory is going to shed much light on that question either, actually, at least not without more sustained and serious engagement with the work of other social sciences, maybe sociology and economics most crucially. So there's been as you'll all know, I mean, there's been an assumption, or there's been a sort of, one of the arguments made by many of the historians that I've been talking about is that the way forward for liberalism is for it to abandon that relatively recent turn to moral neutrality and resume down the path of moral perfectionism and progressivism, which liberalism was walking down prior to the end of the World War II and the advent of Cold War liberalism, which then dominated for the rest of the century. I mean, that's the lesson that Samuel Moyne thinks we're intended to take from his Liberalism Against Itself, and also Alan Cahan's Freedom for Fear. But they both explicitly advocate we need to go back to liberal perfectionism. But what they don't ask is either what were the conditions, or what the conditions were that last made sense of perfectionism as a meaningful option in the period of the new liberalism of Green, Hobson, and Hobhouse, which was the last sort of flurry of, of perfectionist liberalism. So they don't ask whether what those conditions were that made those ideas make sense then, nor whether those conditions remain true of our societies today. They just think they can put liberalism can put the gears in reverse back, to before the Second World War and take the road, take a different road. Now, as I argue in that chapter of my book, I really don't think. I think the conditions that made new liberalism make sense at the end of the Victorian era just don't exist today. So if we want to look back in order to move forward, a lot more work is needed to show that the conditions that make liberalism plausible then are still with us now. So that's the first question I think we need to distinguish here. The second question is really, I think, the most important one. Is there any form of liberalism that can make sense to us today as consistent with the realist constraint? Now, I don't want to say no to that completely, because a large part of liberalism's success stems from how it's managed to imaginatively respond to features of modernity. I think Edmund Foucault's book is really great at this, actually, in arguing how, by acknowledging that society is now characterized by conflict and competition, liberalism actually was able to reimagine and channel those energies into productive and creative ends. So liberalism has been wonderfully imaginative in using, in a sense, the changes of modernity in productive ways. But of course, liberalism has also played its part in forming the ways in which modernity itself has developed. So there's a sense in which liberalism is at home, so to speak, in modernity, in the way modernity has developed. And I think for that reason, we're never going to find that liberalism to core never makes sense to us. But there is a question, I think, of what sort of liberalism makes any sense to us today. And And here there are just numerous questions to be asked, which I am not convinced have been fully appreciated, or where they have been explored, I don't think they've been incorporated properly into this broader inquiry into the social conditions for liberalism today. So just to give you some of the ideas of what I'm thinking of, what can individual freedom mean in a world where economic and technological forces consistently undermine the control that individuals have over their own lives, where technology is no longer so easily presented as a force for individual liberation, but seems to have introduced unprecedented capacities for the regulation and control of our behaviour that's more conducive to authoritarian politics. Does the emphasis on the age-old division between the public and the private continue to make any sense when people demonstrate through their actions now that they're not just willing to give away their privacy, but they enthusiastically do so in order to access the most recent electronic copy of Vanity Fair or to use the latest mobile phone apps, right? They don't seem to care quite as much about privacy as liberals have tended to think that we do. Are the basic freedoms of religion, of speech, association, and so on, are they still necessary or even effective in defending us against political or social tyranny? Or have they themselves become sources of disruption to the social order? Has the faith in constitutional checks and balances been found to be illusionary without ensuring that we have political agents with the right sort of civic virtue who are willing to enforce them? It's actually a conversation we've been having in the UK recently, the so-called good bloke theory of politics, which is there's not just enough to have checks and balances if you haven't got the good bloke who's willing to enforce them. But how far is it possible for any politics to sustain support for itself that focuses on questions of individual character in radically pluralistic societies like our own? Can we sustain any sense of the dignity of human rationality and creativity in light of the advent of AI? When the rewards of engaging in economic activity are diminishing for vast swathes of the population, does this lead people to invest in meaningfulness and purpose in the public sphere, which is hard to reconcile with the goals of liberalism? There are plenty of others, I think. But in short, I think we need to ask this, I think. What sort of freedom is possible today? And then, how far a liberal politics can plausibly be understood as put in the service of that goal? But I think we have to ask that without predetermining the answer, by either assuming that there is any meaningful form of freedom available to us, or that if there is, it's going to be one which will either be amenable to liberalism or best achieved through a liberal politics. So let me just wrap this up. Sorry if yes, we're going on too long. I do apologise. So yeah, just wrap this up very quickly. So the fact is that political theories don't get to determine their own social conditions. Any theory will seem to make sense or be judged comprehensible such that it stands any chance of reorganising political thought and action only by virtue of the historical situation in which it is presented. And those circumstances are almost always created by the actions of others rather than our own thought. And as such, the question cannot be merely whether we still think liberalism remains desirable at some abstract level of normativity or value. Nor are there any easy lessons for us to be drawn from the fact that liberalism has rejuvenated itself successfully in quite different contexts in the past. There is a genuine question that few defences of liberalism have addressed as to how far those conditions which once prevailed and allowed us to make sense of liberalism as a realistic and viable way for us to go forward still hold for us now. Too much work is assuming that today is sufficiently like yesterday that the answer is obvious. And in which case, we can be very confident that not only does liberalism have a future, but that liberalism is the future. It's not obvious to me that confidence is well placed, or at the very least, significantly more work needs to be done by liberals to convince me that it is. Apologies for talking too long.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. No, you didn't. You didn't talk for too long. It was riveting, to be honest. It shows that you don't always need PowerPoint slides. You know, you have such an engaging way of asking questions back to us.
My students disagree with that.
I found your arguments actually very convincing, and it's a different way of tackling a topic we've discussed already here with Paul Kelly, with Alan Cahan, who were former guests in this seminar. So it's really great to bring all this together today. Before opening the floor, perhaps more broadly, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask a couple of questions first. I mean, you feel free to answer whichever you wish in the order you prefer. You mentioned in your book conversations you had with Paul Tucker, and I've read him at length for my own research. I was wondering if institutions, how they fit in your own framework. Do you see them as dependent on these social conditions that you mentioned, trust, legitimacy, shared norms, or do they actively shape and reinforce those conditions? That was a question on institutions. I had a question on the UK context. I know you said you were focusing mostly on the US context, and it's true that the intellectual framework networks have emerged around these ideas in the US. I was wondering if in the UK there's probably less of a movement as such, perhaps a diffuse set of concerns, and does that say something about the resilience of liberalism in the UK? I don't know, I'm just asking that question. And perhaps you wish to draw a clearer distinctions between post-liberalism and populism when answering that question. So that's probably it for now. So
yeah, thank you. I mean, I'll take them in reverse order. And I think part of what's different about the British context to the American context is post-liberals really think the American experiment is effectively a liberal experiment, and it was literally founded on liberal values, and so they occupy this really interesting political position, really, because obviously in America in particular, I mean, it's true everywhere probably, but maybe America in typical American sense is very exaggerated, but to be un-American is political suicide. You've always got to show that you are American, USA, and all that. But actually, post-liberals are really interesting. I mean, they're not saying we need to go back to the founding principles of the Constitution, or they're not originalists in that sense. They're not saying we need to get back to traditional American values or anything like that. They reject traditional American values. They reject the American Constitution because they think it is all liberal. So it was liberal from the start. So sometimes they'll talk about America needs a second founding, or that there was an initial. Apparently there was an original founding before the founding most of us think about, which was on Catholic values apparently. So we need to go back to that. But either way, it's deeply un-American, because they think America is essentially synonymous with liberalism. It is the liberal experiment, and it's gone wrong. I think the difference with Britain, or one of the many differences with Britain, is that it's just not, even if it is plausible, my dog, sorry, even if it is plausible that, sorry, even if it is plausible that America can be presented in that sort of ideologically monolithic way, Britain certainly can't be. We're a mix of liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and we're a hodgepodge of stuff. And some will say to our benefit, and some will say to our detriment. So it's very hard for the entire sort of political system to be denigrated as tainted by liberalism in the same way. Sorry, if you can hear that, that's my dog now trying to escape and bark at the dogs next door because he knows they're out. On the first question, I'm afraid I'm going to tell Paul Tucker, he'll be delighted that you're reading his work. But we have this discussion quite a lot. I mean, I never know a way of answering that sort of question without saying it has to be both. That they in part shape the social conditions, but also creations of the social conditions. It's a sort of answer that I tell my students off for giving. I sort of sit on the fence. It's a bit of both, but I think that has to be the answer. And I think any that sort of rejected the notion that either the conditions produce the institutions or the institutions produce the social conditions or reproduce them, that would be deeply implausible. I know it's not a very interesting answer, but it's the only one I've got.
Should they be redesigned? Is that the way forward?
Well, again, there's a question as to how far that's going to be possible. I mean, I guess one way in
because
which
of the constraints that you mentioned.
Again, checks and balances. I think, to answer my own question, I think one thing has happened, been made very evident in the US, but even I should say here, is that the checks and balances we have don't mean very much unless you've got people who are willing to abide by them. And so, in that sense, those sorts of institutions of connected to checks and balances of executive power, if you don't have the sort of, and this is a very conservative thought in many ways, if you don't have this, or Republican at least, if you don't have the people imbued with civic virtue that are willing to take the time, effort, and risks involved in checking power, then those checks and balances will mean little.
Are we going back to the moral argument, Alan Campbell's third pillar in many ways?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But again, I find myself in a sort of in a position that I find difficult to adopt, which is I think that might be the right way forward, but it might not be available to us.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's hard for me to see that politics today can have the sort of focus on moral character, virtue, civic duty, and all that necessary to get us back to that. I'm not sure that option exists for us today.
Fine, thank you very much. Do we have questions online, Catherine? And then I'll check the chat afterwards. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very, very interesting. And so I have to, there is one question I have to ask because we've read Alan's book and because he came and to discuss it. I was really thinking about what you were saying and I was wondering, I mean, with Alan, there is a suggestion, and obviously enough, he's a historian, and there's this idea that liberalism has shown a sort of remarkable adaptable capacity. And for me, from what you're saying, and perhaps I misunderstood, is that essentially the disagreement between you two could be that ultimately for Alan, there is a crisis within liberalism. Whereas in your case, there is a feeling, and I think that's what you're saying, that in fact there is a possible exhaustion of liberal modernity itself. Have I properly understood?
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I haven't thought of it in that way. I think that's right, yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Because I guess what I'm saying is that Alan is not alone in doing this, but in a sense, I think he thinks the questions of the success or adaptability of liberalism is a question that can be answered sort of internal to the theory itself.
That's right.
And that just doesn't strike me as right. It's one part of the question, but I don't think it's the most important part of the question.
And so, in fact, fundamentally, I haven't read yet Adrian Woolridge's book, but I heard the interview with the New Statesman this week. And I was really struck by how, for him, essentially the solution, and this is what you were discussing with Laurence, is the idea that you should bring back a type of deference, because that's the word he uses. Which pleases me because I wrote a book on political deference.
Yes,
so I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, at last somebody perhaps agrees.
Time has come.
I know. And so he does say that essentially what is missing in the UK is that it is this type of deference, which is the sort of air, the glue, which would allow checks and balances to breathe. And so from what you're saying, you don't believe that this is possible in any way.
I find it hard to see the road. which would get us to there. And again, I don't necessarily disagree.
Yeah.
But the question is how is that form of politics even viable in a sort of democratic age? I don't think he asks that question. One thing I find interesting with that book is that, you know, his argument is that essentially liberalism needs to shift left on economics and shift right on culture, and where the shifting right includes the deference.
Yeah,
but it's really interesting how little he said, and it does mean things like taking a harder stand on immigration, for example. But beyond that, it really is hard to see what else he really is thinking about. In fact, he almost like he says liberalism has to reject the legalization of all drugs. It's like, well, I don't know anyone who's really even advocating that. And it's like he's happy to go left. He's happy to be very stridently left on economics, but quite clearly finds it harder to go right culturally. And he doesn't talk about things like, you know, how to strengthen traditional families, and you know things like that. He does talk about deference. He does talk about restoring standards to education and things and related things. But really, you can tell he's not as comfortable in that area. And I think in part it's because I think he I'd like to think maybe in part it's because he recognises that actually that's a lot harder. It's a much more difficult politics to pull off, probably than the moving left on economics. That would be my hypothesis on that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. I've got other questions, but there are other people who'd like to ask questions. Thank you very much for that.
Right. Next, we have a question on the chat. Thomas van Verden, would you like to perhaps introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from and ask one of your questions. No? Is there a problem perhaps with your...
Should I answer one or?
Yeah, if you have access to them, I thought. You can't use a microphone. Okay, fine. Well, let me start with the first one, I guess. It's a good question. Where does the post-liberal representation of liberalism come from? Yes, is it strategic, intentional? Yes, I think it is. In fact, in the book, one of the other reasons why I think the liberal response to the misunderstanding objection doesn't get us very far is that ultimately I don't think post-liberals are very interested in getting liberalism right. The liberals treat them as if they are academics, but they treat them as if they're engaged in a sort of seminar discussion like this. And hey, look at page 12. Locke says liberty, not license. That's not what they're doing. They're doing politics, and they're a part of a political movement. And for them, it's really important that they paint liberalism as so terrible that the only alternative is to throw it out. That they paint liberalism as a homogenous thing, so there's no meaningful difference between classical and more recent progressive liberalism, because then you can't do what some liberals have done and said, okay, we reject, like Mark Liller, we reject the contemporary identity politics. Let's go back to that old liberalism previous. No, most liberals want to say, no, it's all or nothing. It's all bad. So in that case, in that sense, they want to reduce our choices to a binary choice, and so it's completely strategic how they characterize liberalism. It is intentional. They are intelligent. They are intelligent people, and how do you put this? I mean, I think they've done an awful lot of very good work, scholarly work. I would not count their work in post-liberalism amongst that. I guess put it that way, and that's because I think they're just doing something different. And so us, philosophers or theorists who go, but you got it wrong. It's not what he says. Yeah, in a sense, we're just handing it to them. We're not fighting the fight they're fighting.
in that sense. So yes, I would say it is completely strategic.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions? Don't hesitate to switch on your mics. Catherine, you said you had another question?
Hang on, can you see that there are 2 more questions online?
Ah.
Shall I answer those?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Second question about realism and materialism. I don't think realism is committed to a class-based view of freedom, a view of politics. I should say, I think actually one of the benefits of post-liberalism, one thing I think it's done that has been to the credit of our discourse, is to reintroduce the talk of classes back into politics. I should say, but no, there's no real there's no commitment to class. I don't think I have much to say about that because I've not thought about it enough. But I know it's one of those sort of questions that does arise. Do you consider the recent emergence of neo-reaction influence relevant to post-liberalism? So I think post-liberalism is one branch of the new right in America. But I think it's a real problem. Well, I think commentators are only just coming around to the fact that the new right is a very diverse and pluralistic body of thought, and what national conservatism is big in America, and it's big over here as well now with the Reform Party. And often you'll see commentators sort of talk about that in the same breath as post-liberalism, but they're really very different. In fact, in the book, I sort of point out in the conclusion that I don't think there's much chance of post-liberalism having much influence here, but national conservatism might be. And then people like Curtis Yarvin in America, who wants to bring back the monarchy, essentially, and then particularly sort of out there characters like Bronze Age pervert. I don't know if you've heard of him. Political theorist as well. Very radical people there. I think actually one interesting thing is post-liberalism, I think, has found itself somewhat outmaneuvered recently, and has in this attempt to not want to have anyone to the right of them, has actually found there's lots of people to the right of them, and they've opened the doors for those sorts of people to now enter the discourse. And so I think what's happened actually is post-liberalism has made credible more far right, at least, sort of positions that have now allowed other sort of properly far right, should we say, thinkers to get in on the public discourse. That's what I think is going to be post-liberalism's lasting legacy, actually, unfortunately.
Thank you. Right. I was wondering, since you address critiques of liberalism and post-liberalism, how do you, where do you place, I mean, you do cover it in your book, but your view is more, I would say, pessimistic than Alan Cahan. Where do you position yourself compared with, say, John Gray, in terms of, that pessimism that I think comes across, as in the conditions are no longer there or may not be recovered?
Yeah, okay, that's a question. I guess maybe maybe I'm more pessimistic, actually, that's a discovery for Friday afternoon. Because I don't think. So one part of the talk I cut out because it would have been even longer is that there are some realists who think, well, there is a realist answer to my question, as to what forms of liberalism make sense, which is that minimal forms of liberalism make sense, where that means either judicial class liberalism of fear, and that's a sort of answer that Bernard Williams actually gives, and several of his followers have recently. My colleague Ed Hall, I mentioned before, he just published a book sort of exploring and extending Schlar's liberalism of fear. So that sort of form of philosophically and morally sort of thinner liberalism is one answer to that realists give. And another, obviously, the modus vivendi liberalism that John Gray is associated with, from the two concepts of two faces of liberalism. Sorry, I must say, really, I think John Gray has done a disservice to public discourse in the UK, because he labelled himself as a post-liberal, and has until very recently kept using the term post-liberalism. And I think if an audience reads that, they're going to think to themselves, well, that means he rejects liberalism. Of course, he doesn't. He just rejects one branch of, or one form of liberalism, and advocates its modus vivendi liberalism. And I do worry, sorry, this is an incidental point, but I do worry that if the public is told long enough that liberalism is dead, and even if you caveat that several paragraphs later and say, oh, I only mean one form of caveat, if you told the public that liberalism is dead long enough, they might start believing it. So I actually think that that's a bad service to public discourse on Gray's part. But I guess my worry with both the modus vivendi and the liberalism of fear alternatives is effectively that they just don't have the resources to meet the current political challenge. In a world where I think the state is being greater demands are being put on the state is being expected to do more. Politics is expected to do more, in response to the populist challenges. Neither modus vivendi or liberalism of fear really give you the sort of resources to do that. It's all about being worried about power and the cruelty that the state can inflict upon the population, and so on. Or modus vivendi is all about maintaining peace and stability and not much else. But that doesn't look like it's going to meet the current political moment. And that we need a liberalism that's going to do and deliver more for the people if people are going to come back to it. But where I guess that makes me more pessimistic than Gray is that all the questions that I've just been raising, which is I'm not sure that there is a plausible, meaningful mode of liberalism that can make sense, that can deliver that anymore. So again, I find myself in a sort of tragic, in a certain sort of melodramatic sense, I guess, of thinking that there may be an answer, but it's not an answer that's available to us. And I guess that would make me more pessimistic than Gray, because he does still think there is a liberalism that's available to us, and I'm not so sure, and a liberalism that he thinks will work, and I'm just not as convinced as he is about that.
Okay. Would you say the global financial crisis was the main trigger in, a transition to, distrust of liberalism? Is it just one event among others, technology and wars, etc., or do you place it in a more central position?
Yeah, I think there are numerous causes. That has to be one of the most significant. But the reaction, the liberal response to that as well, the inequality that's generated. But also, I think in a more general level, I think it's in this country. If you have over a decade of governments being, It's my father. I'll have to ask him if he bought that book. Sorry, if you have over a decade of voting in governments that say they're going to reduce immigration to tens of thousands, and it goes up to almost 2 million. I think it was at some point in a year. I think whatever the policy would have been, prolonged, sustained reneging of the entire political class, regardless of what party it was, is going to have an effect on trust in politics as well. So yeah, I'm not one of those people who think the causes of populism are just economic in that sense, although I think they are incredibly important. I do think there are political, cultural causes as well.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, going back on this, in fact, I found myself listening to John Gray less than a year ago, and he was saying precisely on the subject that the main problem, and that's why I think he was much less positive than expected, is that he said in the UK the main problem was getting back a set of values, of common values on which to restart what would be a liberal structure, and he was very pessimistic about what would be regaining a common set of values on which essentially what Adrian Woolwich is looking for would be possible. And I'm wondering what you think about that.
Yeah,
because
no, I think
those are the questions we're having in France at the moment.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
We've tried to have discussions, even going back to people like Gordon Brown, about going back to British values.
Yes.
And they get nowhere. They get nowhere at all. And for in a certain sense, obvious and understandable reasons. I think Gray is right about that. I just don't think it's a viable way of refounding a political project. In a sense, it makes the same mistake that I think lots of moralists make in political theory, which is just to assume there is a consensus of values out there, and you go and that's your foundation. You ground politics on that foundation.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think to myself, there is nothing new in this, because Isaiah Berlin, at the end of his famous essay, does go and explain that, in fact, what you've got to accept is value pluralism. So, in fact, it was possible for Berlin to write this in the 1950s, because essentially the type of value pluralism meant that it would be less problematic than it is today. But then, in fact, we find ourselves in this this circle in which we are endlessly saying, okay, if we are true liberals, then in fact we are going to actually accept value pluralism. But then the problem is that we no longer have common standards on which to agree. What is the value of our common political foundations? And so that's where somebody like Nigel Farage is incredibly powerful, because he's able to undermine this and at the same time tell you that he's got a solution when he hasn't got one.
Yeah. And of course, the wonders of a first past the post system like we've got is that really you don't need that many people to agree with the values that you say everyone agrees with in order to get power. It wouldn't take a third, as in the Labour landslide we had here a couple of years ago. Only around about a third of people voted for them. So that's all Farage needs, and he just needs a third of the people to share the values he thinks are in some sense uniquely British, or whatever it is. It goes back to that old problem that was there in Berlin's first in that essay, which is. There's no sort of necessary connection between value pluralism and liberalism. Yeah. I think eventually he completely recognised that was true. But I think that is part of the problem here. And I think one of the other things that where I think, just to advocate realism or beat the realist drum a bit more as well. And I think it isn't so much that we have to reject the idea that there can be something. Well, there could be something like a consensus on values. It's that where there are, or something close to a consensus of values, they're usually the product of politics. That's to say they're the artifact of politics in some sense. But the philosophers too often sort of treat them as sort of existing sort of independently of politics, and therefore the politics can be grounded on them. Whereas realists want to flip that on its head and say, well, the only reason why there may have been widespread agreement on freedom, liberal freedom, for example, at some point, is for X, Y, Z reasons, political, social, economic, and so on. So you shouldn't take that consensus as in some sense given, and therefore you can't start your political theorizing from that position either. So yes, I think that avenue of grounding liberalism and pluralism is no longer so easily available to us either.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we have time for one more question from Stefan. Stefan is asking in the chat.
Yeah, a very quick question. If we consider liberalism to be an ideology, I was wondering if that made post-liberalism an ideology too. That is to say, a blueprint for society with political support, or is it just a temporary backlash?
And I would add from our conversation yesterday, Matt, you said that maybe post-liberalism has had its moment. Is it over already? So.
Yeah, no, Stefan, thank you. I mean, I've no problem thinking about post-liberalism as an ideology, actually. In fact, I think, if I remember correctly, I can't remember the author now, though, but there was a paper I remember seeing recently that treated it as an ideology and analysed it via Michael Frieden's methodology, and it seems very plausible to me to treat it as a methodology, with central concepts and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it seems very plausible. I don't think it will end up being particularly different from many other strands of conservative political thought over the last 200 years, actually. But, and this goes back to your question about the contemporary, has it had its moment? I mean, I think I think it is a backlash. There's no doubt about that. So it's an ideology that I think is not new, but it's been given new momentum and maybe a new sort of lick of paint, let's say, for the current moment. I do wonder whether the moment has passed, though, for two reasons. And I shouldn't say this given the I still want the book to sell. But one is that post-liberals were very happy when Trump won a second time. I thought it was ludicrous that they put any hope in Trump realizing post-liberal ends. I mean, if you would think Trump of all people had any interest in betraying his economic class, or Trump of all people has any interest in bettering the moral character of the American people. It always just struck me as absolutely absurd. But nevertheless, they were very happy. But I think we've had long enough of Trump 2.0 to see that the post-liberalism isn't any closer. And even, J.D. Vance, he is friends with a lot of the post-liberals. He is a converted Catholic as well. He called himself of the post-liberal right. I think there are numerous influences on Vance's ideology, or worldview, I should say. Not all of them are coherent or consistent with one another. And I think, things like the Iran war show that the post-liberal dimension of his worldview is maybe not as powerful as other dimensions. So in that regard, I wonder whether post-liberalism is not having the sort of impact on American politics as many were predicting or hoping, if you will, of that inclination. The other reason why I wonder whether the moment has passed is simply because post-liberals themselves have sort of dissipated. There was a Substack for a while called the Post-Liberal Order that Deneen and Vanule and Chad Pecknold and Gladden Papin and others contributed to. That no longer exists. Deneen apparently has just said he no longer wants to talk about post-liberalism. Said Sohrab Ahmari has actually distanced himself from post-liberalism despite being the young buck of the lot. sort of in many ways started the whole thing, really, in a certain sense, with his debate with David French. And even Adrian Rabiul's he said he's no longer interested in arguing about it and just think it's a given. We already live in a post-liberal age. So there's a certain sense in which the post-liberals themselves are no longer represented intellectual movement in the way that I think they did a few years ago as well. So if you can edit this out of the version you put online, yeah, I do think the post-liberal moment has probably gone. But that doesn't mean I don't think it will still have influence. I mean, I think it will still have significant influence. I think, in particular, its main influence is going to be shifting the right to a position whereas previously it put culture before politics and said, you change the culture and the politics will follow. Now I think the post-liberals, they're the vanguard in saying, no, we're fed up with that. We're not going to wait for that anymore. No, we're going to seize power and then we'll change culture. And I think that's going to make a meaningful difference to the new right.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree with the lasting influence. Absolutely. Perfect timing. So this is exactly the kind of discussion and exchange that makes a seminar worth it. Thank you very much to Matt Sleat. As we come to the end of this year's seminar, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us throughout the year. Maybe round of applause for Matt.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate it.
It was great. So on behalf of the organising team, thank you, Matt, and I wish everyone a pleasant summer break. It's probably too soon. For many of us, it hasn't started yet, but when it comes, right? And we hope to see you all again next academic year with a new programme and another series of stimulating discussions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.